all for being here tonight. My name is Jim Ludis. I'm the Executive Director of the Pell Center, and this is just a wonderful way to kick off our 2015 Fall Lecture Series. We're here, of course, tonight to talk about Laudato Si, the Pope's encyclical on the environment. But I also want to draw your attention to the list of other upcoming events in the program. We've got a great panel coming up in October on cybersecurity and the internet. In the presidential campaign, we're going to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the United Nations with our friends in international programs. We've got the 2015-2016 McGinty Chair in History, a scholar by the name of William Issel, who's here in residence at Salve this year. He's going to do a wonderful talk in November on the civil rights movement in San Francisco. And then we're going to end the semester on December 2nd with a couple of old friends, actually, people that we've had speak in the not-too-distant past, Tim Hoyt and Hyatt Alvey, both on the faculty at the War College, and we're going to talk about the Middle East. We've got another event that we are highly confident is going to happen, and I can't say anything more than that. It's somebody who's got a great job in Washington. And as soon as we're able to announce that, you'll get an email from us. But so if you're not on our email list, please do sign up. That could be something that happens with just a few days' notice. So I also just wanted to point out one other little piece of business here. We produced an annual report for the first time this year, at least for the first time in the few years that I've been here. If you have any interest in actually seeing this, let us know. We'd be happy to get you a copy. We are printing them on demand to try to be environmental in our own sense. So if you have any interest in seeing what the Pell Center has been up to and sort of a little bit more about where we're headed, we're happy to share that with you. So without further ado, we're here tonight to talk about Laudato Si, which is the Pope's encyclical on the environment. It is not a short document, but it's not a long document either. But it covers so much ground that we knew that we couldn't do justice to it with just one person. No, not even two people. Not three, not four. It took 5 people to try to do justice to this. But we really have put together just a tremendous lineup of colleagues from here at the university, philosophers and theologians, anthropologists, scientists, and even political scientists. So I'm going to do a quick introduction of each of these folks. I'm going to throw one big softball question at them, and then after they've had a chance to respond and maybe sensitize you to a text that perhaps you have not read, there's no harm in that, we'll then open the floor to Q&A, and I'll run around like Phil Donahue or Merv Griffin, I'm not sure what somebody, like Jimmy Fallon, and come to you. So if you have a question, raise your hand, and I'll come right to you. But just a quick introduction to each of tonight's speaker. Immediately to my left is Dr. Craig Condella, who's been teaching at Salve Regina since 2006 as a member of the philosophy department and as part of the environmental studies, global studies, and humanities doctoral programs. Craig, along with Tony Lopresti, who I did see come in, they both emailed me within about 7 minutes of each other, saying, let's do something about this encyclical. So Craig and Tony, thank you for your leadership in making tonight happen. Next to Craig is Dr. Deb Curtis, who is the chair of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology and the program coordinator of the Global Studies program here at Salve Regina. Deb, thank you for being here. Next to Deb is Dr. Jayme Hennessy, who has her doctorate in moral theology with a specialization in virtue ethics, and she is here to really represent the theological perspective of this document. Next to Jayme is Dr. Susan Meschwitz, who's an assistant professor of chemistry at Salve Regina University here. She received her Ph.D. in organic chemistry from Brown and went on to a postdoctoral fellowship in biological chemistry and molecular pharmacology at Harvard Medical School. There's a lot of science in this encyclical. We wanted somebody who could keep us all honest and keep us grounded, and Susan is a great choice. And certainly last but not least, is my colleague, Dr. Chad Raymond, who's an associate professor of political science and international relations here at Salve. He teaches in the undergraduate department of political science and global studies, as well as in the graduate program in international relations. So they are a tremendous resource. They have each spent some time with the text. And so I'm going to begin with a sort of a big general question to all of you. From your perspective, from the perspective of your academic specialization and your discipline, what is this document and why is it so important? Craig.
Shall I start? So thank you, first of all, to Jim and the Pell Center for putting this together. Tony and I did present this idea, and I didn't think it would happen so quickly. I was hoping maybe in the spring we'd put something together, but it ended up being timed very well with the Pope's visit. And thanks to the panel for agreeing on fairly short notice to partake in this discussion. The reason why, in part, I think we have so many panelists here is because of the nature of the document. That show of hands, how many people have actually read? I mean, I'm not quizzing you or anything, but I'm just curious as to how many folks have looked at least part of it. So it is longer, right? It's about, I guess, 200 pages, somewhere in that range. But it's a far-ranging document. So, in general, we could say it's a papal encyclical on the environment. But what does that mean? Does it make it a work of science or ecology? Well, in part, yes, right? That it's kind of building from science. But I think more than anything, for me at least, it's a work about morality and about what we're called to do. Not only as Christians or Catholics, but as a global community. And one of the things that I find interesting about this encyclical is that Pope Francis, in writing this, is addressing the entire world. So even at the conclusion of the work, he has two prayers, one specifically for Christians and one for everybody else. So his assumption here is that this isn't a work just for a narrow group of people, but it's a work for all people, and calling us to a new idea of what progress means, that it's not sort of narrowly defined according to this kind of technocratic paradigm that he talks about. It's a critique of throwaway culture. It's a term that he uses quite often throughout the text. In this recognition that our home planet, right, the planet Earth, is a common home, one that we all share, and that as a unified human family, we're called to be responsible both to it and to one another. So one of the themes that he revisits throughout the text is this connection between environmental abuses and mistreatment of the poor and disadvantaged in our society, which, taking the name of Francis, I think many Catholics would expect this sort of thing, of paying attention to both the earth and the poor, not as distinct problems, but as problems that are related to one another. So hopefully that works as a little bit of a summary for those of you who haven't had a chance to look at it, and also some of the things that I take to be important.
So just to put a very fine point on it, because of the way some of this has been reported in the press, is this the climate change encyclical?
No. And I only say that because, you could do a word search of this and see how many times climate change comes up. Not much. It's one problem among other problems. Again, to kind of cut to the chase about this, that he does implicate human activity in the elevated levels of greenhouse gases, and he is pretty clear about that. But he doesn't spend a great deal of time on that. Again, he's kind of working from what science gives us and not taking issue or really spending much time on that, but saying this is the state of the world as we have it. What's our moral responsibility to respond to it? So again, this has been kind of the controversial kind of issue, and we might end up talking about this more as a larger group, but that's way too narrowly defined to me to say that it's the climate change.
Okay, so before I let you off the hook, Craig, then
sure.
If in your as the philosopher on this panel, your key takeaways from that discipline in this document.
To me, it's very much. It goes to my own leanings as being a work rooted in what philosophers would refer to as a deep ecology, which is to say that the environment is not one problem among other problems, but that it's a pervasive issue that encompasses a lot of other problems. And to me, and again, Professor Hennessy might know a lot more about this than I do, but it's not so much a break of what we find in Catholic doctrine up until this point, but it is different, where it's not just a future generations argument that says we have to preserve our resources resources for those yet to come. That's part of it, but he says quite clearly at times that that's not the whole thing, that there's intrinsic value in the natural world. And that deep ecological approach to me is importantly new and different from what I've seen previously.
And I'm gonna, just because I'm a little bit in my own professorial mode here tonight, I was pondering the distinction between the ecology and the environment. And so I'm just gonna share with you a basic definition which I Googled. But it's from the folks at Merriam-Webster. Ecology is defined as a science that deals with the relationships between groups of living things and their environments. So it's not just the environment, it's broader than that.
Right, which includes, of course, as he says again and again, the human community, right? So he's always quite clear not to lose sight of that. That's all. And, you know, how we rank beings, right, is a sort of game I don't think he wants us to get into, but he's always careful to emphasize the importance of human dignity, that is an important piece to this, but as part of this larger sort of global environmental community.
Excellent, thank you, Craig. Deb, as an anthropologist, what is your principal takeaway from this document, and what does it mean to you?
Okay, well, I'll start with the latter question. What does it mean for me? First, I have a confession. And I think that,
Very, very Catholic.
right, very Catholic of me. This is the first encyclical that I've ever read in its entirety and then read again. For me, it was like one long prayer. It was so beautiful, so tragic, but so beautiful. So that's what, I just wanted to put that out there as my personal experience. But what it means to me as an anthropologist is this wonderful opportunity. There are, within anthropology, there is a faction of anthropologists called environmental anthropologists. And those are the folks that spend their careers studying the interaction between humans and the environment. So let me just back up just a bit. As most of you know, as many of you know, cultural anthropologists traditionally worked in non-Western societies, or what we used to call third world countries or developing countries, and we now use the term the global south. And the global south includes Africa, Latin America, parts of Asia, and the Middle East. So for decades, this is where anthropologists have been working. And part of our methodology is to spend long periods of time within these small-scale communities. Long periods could range from a year to 2 years, and our responsibility is to learn the local language, of course. So the anthropologists who have made a career studying the environment match what they're calling for professionally is exactly what Pope Francis is calling for. And namely, for those of you who haven't read the document, anthropologists and Pope Francis are calling for a union between what we call indigenous knowledge or traditional knowledge, TK, with scientific data. So Pope Francis, he numbers the paragraphs, which makes it very convenient for us to refer to the document. So in part 2, in the section called Cultural Ecology, number 143, he's calling for a greater attention to local cultures when studying environmental problems. And this is exactly what anthropologists want to see happen. They want indigenous peoples from the Arctic, from the Pacific, joining with environmental scientists as a way to complement the data, as a way to fact check. Now let me just back up 1 second and tell you a little bit about what indigenous knowledge means. I was talking to my students the other day when we were talking about the last place on the planet to be inhabited, and that was the Pacific, and that was probably about 850 years before Christ. And imagine the ancient seafarers when they were negotiating or navigating the immense Pacific Ocean. This was a time before compasses, before sextants, right? And what they would do to get from island to island is that they would, at night, they would use the stars, and during the day, they would study the cloud colors and formations. And more impressively than that, they would watch as the swells from the ocean hit the sides of the boat. Let me just say that one more time, because I know that there are people in this room who are big sailors. Imagine being out, Dr. Brady, in the Atlantic without any markers, without any GPS, without any compasses, and just watching the ways the swells of the ocean hit the bow of the boat. And that's the way you negotiated to get hundreds and hundreds of miles from island to island. That's what we call indigenous knowledge. That sort of intimate understanding of the environment, and that's what the Inuit have, and that's what the people living in the Pacific have, and the Fijian Islands, and it's all based on observation. So one, anthropologist would like to see the indigenous people joined with the climate scientists. Two, and Pope Francis calls for this as well, which is so beautiful. He says that any sort of change or any strategy that takes place, sort of adaptive strategies to the crisis that we're facing, indigenous people have to be at the table, metaphorically speaking. They have to be working with international government bodies, members of the UN. They have to be with members of their nation states, their respective nation states, so they can come up with meaningful sustainable development, not development that's going to fail the way development projects have failed for decades, but meaningful development projects to address the crisis. And then lastly, and I think that Pope Francis says this I know he says this as well, is that intervention has to take place at the sub-state level. And again, this is what anthropologists are calling for with regard to the crisis. We have to intervene at the sub-state level, meaning at our local communities. I think I've gone on a little bit too long, so forgive me, but I'll defer to my colleagues.
It's a document that evokes a lot of passion in the response, so thank you for that. Jayme Hennessy from the chemistry department. Excuse me, from the theology department.
It would be a problem if I was from the chemistry department. There would have been explosions already. I'm not noted for my skills in chemistry. Thank you very much.
Pull that microphone right down to you.
Thank you very much for this invitation tonight to share some of the riches of Laudato Si with you. It's a complex document because it has to address complex problems. But what the document wants us to do is to dig deeper into our human experience. Why? To recognize that the degradation that we see in the world, the degradation of the environment cannot be seen as separate from the degradation of humanity, all right? And to trace back not to just symptoms that can be solved through technology or the anthropological analysis is important, sociological analysis is important, scientific analysis is important, but not to just default to that information. What the document wants to do is to dig deeper into a reality that calls us to something that has been consistent all through the writings of Pope Francis and his ministry. And it's to embody that tender love of mercy. Why? In doing so, what does that mean? The document calls us to take a stand. The document calls us from indifference. The document calls us from the false love of consumerism, where our desires for happiness, right, are directed to material things that don't last nor give us happiness. What the document wants to remind us of is our very dignity as human beings. So it calls us from indifference. It calls us to live out the full potential of our human dignity. And what does that then mean? The document recognizes that each and every one of us is called to become a particular type of person. that the vocation to care for the environment, the vocation to care for those who are excluded by economic systems, that is our vocation in life. We are called to care for those who are vulnerable. And to do so, we have to become a particular type of person. And who is it that we need to become? Who is it that we need to become? It calls us to rise to the full dignity of persons who are conscious of how their choices, their decisions, and their actions play out in this larger world, for everything is connected. And our actions work in the world for good or sometimes evil things that we do not intend. So it calls us to this awakening to understand who we are and our potential to live, our potential to act, our potential to become that presence of love in the world. Now, in some cases, that could be seen as a soft thing, right? What does it mean to talk about love? But I think it's important to recognize that the Pope, throughout this document, keeps going back to the idea of a common home. Now, one of the things that distinguishes this document, all right, and points to a trend in Roman Catholic theology, right, is to try to extend principles of Catholic social teaching about common good, about the universal destination of goods, about subsidiarity, about solidarity. Subsidiarity, our responsibility to act on a local level. Solidarity, our capacity to love our brothers and sisters who are at a distance from us. It makes the statement that climate is a common good. And the Pope was very clear about this. You know, the science, right? The science has come out on one side. People question the accuracy of the science and its claims. But the point is, climate has been declared a common good. Why would it be declared a common good? Because there are places in this world that 20 years ago, their cities were below sea level, and you could watch the water lap at the seawall around it. There are places years ago, because of their poverty, they counted on tourism. And now the coral reefs are dying because the ocean warmed up by 1 degree. There are the Philippines, right? The Philippines and the devastation incurred by typhoons, where people don't have insurance to rebuild their homes and their lives have been destroyed, right, by storms, right? And so climate is a common good we have to not care for, but protect. And it's a strong verb that exists in Catholic social teachings that calls each one of us, right, to protect. But to protect how? With a tender love that each one of us is capable of. With a tender love you use to nurture your own children. With the tender love that you hold the most vulnerable people in your family together. And so that image of the common home is very accessible to us, because we know what it means to take care of people in our home, right? We know what it means to take care of our home. Why? Because we create homes so our loved ones can flourish. And Catholic social teachings tell us that the love that we have for our children, the love we have for our brothers and sisters, is the same love that we are called to extend to the most vulnerable people who are often excluded in this world. So it's a document that takes that principle of mercy, right, and brings it into this very complex reality, right, to remind us who we are, who we're called to become, and the great work that each one of us is capable of doing, right, because of our human dignity. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, from the Department of Chemistry, Dr. Susan Meschwitz.
Thank you. I thank you for the invitation to be here this evening. So what I want to say is that I believe the Pope is clearly informed on the science that's underpinning the environmental challenges that we're facing today. He has the Pontifical Scientific Academy to make sure of that. And not to mention that he had received a degree in chemistry before he entered the seminary. I don't know if you all knew that. So he's a scientist. But I don't think he presumes to settle any scientific questions in this document, nor do I believe he wants to be the final word or the final say in the science, in climate science.
Susan, could you just pull the microphone a little closer? There you go.
Rather, he has added, from what I see, a new dimension to the dialogue, and that's the moral dimension. As a scientist, data is important, I spend, most of us scientists spend much of our time collecting data, analyzing data. We use that data to help us understand the world around us and draw conclusions and make hypotheses. But that's not what makes all humans tick. In fact, what probably makes most humans tick is emotions and feelings and what you value. That's what's going to make you want to do what is right and what is good. And I think that's what the Pope here is invoking, is our moral obligation. So with the science aside, we're focusing on our moral obligation to do what is right. And with that, I think I look at this document and I say, okay, the science is here. We have that, but now the moral moment is also here. And I think with science and values coming together, finally, this might be what we need, this momentum to move this issue forward, so that we can come into dialogue with each other, scientists and politicians. Everybody can now have a dialogue and hopefully move forward and find solutions to the environmental issues and challenges that we're facing today. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that's a wonderful segue, Chad, to your universe in the world of political science. Dr. Chad Raymond.
I really don't know what universe that might be, but so I'll make three quick points about the encyclical. The first point is basically I like to wish everybody here a happy Eid al-Adha and Yom Kippur. Thank you for coming out on two important religious holidays. So my first point is that this is a very ecumenical statement. He is directing his words to not just Catholics, not just Christians, but the entire world. The second point I'd like to make is the documents, it's deceptively simple. He's talking about some very, very complex issues, but from the standpoint of a call to action. He uses phrases such as personal transformation throughout the document. So he's giving voice to people that usually are not heard, and he's saying that because we're all connected, we need to take what is happening to those people into account and base our actions more on how they affect humanity as a whole, rather than just individual self-interest. And I think I'm on my third point, and that is he uses an analysis or a form of analysis that from an academic standpoint can be called institutional economics. So he's looking at things very differently from the way typically most people in the United States look at them. Here we have this kind of motif of the individual. Individuals have complete control or complete influence over their own situation in life. And he takes the opposite approach. He's looking at some very, very powerful institutions that exist in the world, such as the global financial system. And he's saying that these institutions, because they function as the rules of the game, are tilted against the mass of humanity, that they are designed explicitly to profit and empower the few at the expense of the many. So I'll stop there.
All right, so now this is where you guys get to be involved. If you've got a question, raise your hand and I will come to you, and you will have a chance to engage our wonderful panel here. While you're thinking, I'm going to just start with one question. One thing that emerged to me as I read this document, again and again and again, was the role of humanity in a larger ecosystem. And you couldn't help read this without thinking of the passage in Genesis that mentions dominion. Man's dominion over nature. Towards the end, towards the end of the document, the Pope talks about dominion being responsible stewardship. That's not the dominion that I grew up with. Jayme, would you care to respond to that?
I'd be very happy to respond to that. Some of my most favorite and kind of awkward memories is as a musician playing for the Nature Conservancy prayer services. They read the Genesis story, and when it comes to that word, you see people, just sputtering because they don't want to say it. And I think one of the tricky things comes with an understanding this word dominion. What does it mean? Power can be used in different ways, true? I can use my power virtuously to uplift, to protect, and to care for people, or I can use it viciously to destroy, true? Every one of us has power in this room. How do we use it? Right? And so the word dominion in Genesis is very complicated. Biblical scholar studies have broken this down. First of all, if you take dominion and the idea of kingship and read it in the context of the document itself in Genesis, Genesis is a later scriptural story. It's coming after the exile in Babylon, where the Jewish people had been enslaved and knew the brutal force of what it meant to live as a slave in a very violent world where might meant right. And so the first thing is, to understand kingship in the Old Testament, you look to Ezekiel 34 when it talks about what does it mean to be a good king. And the good king is the good shepherd who cares for his people. And they're very, very clear about that in the Old Testament. Power is never used in a vicious way. It's used to protect. It's used to nurture. It's used to care for. Then secondarily, biblical scholars write about the significance of dominion coming out after the experience in exile, after being slaves, in the larger context of the use of power to protect, all right, and the use of power to create a world, right, where people have the opportunity to be free of slavery. You have the rest on the Sabbath day, which was unusual in that world. You didn't get the seventh day off. It's kind of like today, you work every day. But that idea, there was this sense of respect, all right, for peace built in, respect for all creation, including animals. Right? And you look at the larger, if you look at the context of Genesis 1 anyways, it's a vegetarian world, there's no meat eating, all right? Human beings are declared good, yes, to the crown of creation, but given responsibility to protect and to care for and nurture. Does that help?
That helps.
Could I jump in on that?
Absolutely.
So just to add very quickly, he begins, and this is in the second paragraph, he says, "We have come to see ourselves as her," meaning nature's lords and masters, entitled to plunder her at will. If you read some early modern philosophers like Francis Bacon and Rene Descartes, they will use this language word for word, that we must make ourselves the lords and masters of nature. And that was part of the modern project, and it was a project in some ways that I think we can sympathize with. It's emerging from a time when, the Black Plague had wiped out a third of the European population, and a lot of philosophers and scientists said we have to get better at this sort of thing. Too many people are suffering, too many people are dying. We need better science, we need better technology, we need better medicine. So I think the project is sympathetic, but it went off the rails in a sense, that it became this kind of unbridled exploitation, which Pope Francis refers to. And he uses that language at the beginning, that this is how we've come to understand dominion. And he's trying to really, and he does come back to this again and again, that the more power we have, the more responsibility we have. And that goes to more powerful nations as well. So, he never mentions the United States, for example, by name, but it's implicit that we have more responsibilities as a powerful nation than someone who's weaker.
Right. And if I could continue on that with Pope Francis, he goes back to the words, he links dominion with the other command to till and to keep, right, the earth, to till and to keep creation. So there is that responsibility to bring life, sustenance, human flourishing, right, from the land, but to keep it as well. Right? And, within the Jewish tradition, there were times to give even the land itself a chance to rest. So the observation has been we've been doing a great job of tilling and not so much a great job of keeping. A great job of using, not so much a great job of caring.
So I have a question for, I suppose, the entire panel. As you've introduced the encyclical so far, it seems to be centered around this concept of the importance of the environment in relation to various countries and various groups of people's positions in the world. And there's a kind of famous Roman maxim that is, the strong do what they can while the weak do what they must. And this seems to be a paradigm that humanity faces throughout history. And right now we're looking at it again, except instead of strong and weak, it's rich and poor. And Professor Curtis specifically mentioned that we need to bring the local groups to the table in these massive accords that we look at to, help care for the environment. But my question is, how could we possibly hope to shift that paradigm? Because it's based in the fact that the rich have the power to make decisions, while the poor are forced to, face those very implications. I saw a documentary recently where a group tried to impose environmental development on a country whose industry is still developing. They sought to power a village with one solar panel, and all they were able to do was power the refrigerator for the medicine that they had brought to the village. It was useless, backwards. I mean, this kind of top-down look at it, at the entire environmental issue, how could we possibly begin to switch that paradigm?
I want to take
Do you want me to take this, Deb?
Take it.
I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this without offending the entire room. If we look at what started the Middle East back in the very end of 2010, beginning of 2011, we saw people without guns, without tanks, without aircraft, standing up to some extremely brutal regimes. And in many cases, toppling those regimes, what came after wasn't necessarily much better. But in some cases, those situations were driven by the environmental costs of the rich exploiting what I would term an unfair share of what they should have been holding in dominion. And in fact, if we look at what's going on in Syria now, I would characterize that as a resource war, because if you look back at the time the civil war there started, there were a large number of people from the countryside who had lost their farms because of drought. And they migrated to the cities. They had no work. They were being ignored by the government. So we are seeing the ability of people who have been denied a seat at the table claiming that seat. And I think the question for folks in societies like ours is, do we want to let things slide that far and possibly end up like those folks are right now? I mean, you look at what's happening with the EU. They're screaming about some countries a few thousand refugees when there's been 2 million in Turkey for like 3 years, 1 million in Lebanon. It's like 25% of the population is refugees. So we are going to feel the effects one way or another, and it's a question of when do we sit down at the same table as these other people.
Jayme. Oh, thanks. I think a few things to know about this encyclical also to work with what you stated here and the power of the Romans. First, the encyclical itself represents a number of voices, and there are voices from, and I know I'm going to use the wrong word, developing nations known as
Global South.
Global South, thank you. The Global South, their voices are in here. And the very question you're raising about the possibility of taking folks in the Global South and introducing new technologies to them that are basically more environmentally friendly, like solar, it's very clear here when it talks about the indigenous people. You must work with them. You just can't run in here and say, no, you can't use oil, you can't use petroleum. You have the moral responsibility to set them up in ways that they will flourish. And this is a key word behind the idea of a common good, is that you have to create a situation where human life will flourish, not just survive, but flourish, that people will rise into the fullness of their human dignity. Secondarily, with the idea of the principle, might is right, the strong, and then you have the weak. You want to recognize that more and more when moral theologians and some ethical philosophers are working today, they're using different models. Some that are working with game theory and moral theology have realized that the best model for today is cooperation, not might makes right. And so how do you bring different people together to cooperate? Why? Because we have to, right, work for sustainability. As my colleague here, Susan, has noted, this is the moral moment, right? And the document itself says this is the moment for which we're all accountable. So you have a number of philosophers that are proposing new models, and some based on evolutionary science. Stephen Pope, in his work on moral theology and evolution, said really the new model is not so much cooperation, it may be a model of benevolence. And you have Alistair McIntyre, who's also working with biology and moral theology or ethics, proposes that the new model, recognizing the vulnerability every single one of us has, is a model of just generosity. So fortunately, there's a lot out there to combat that Roman ethos. I think we should all be happy about that.
No.
I hope that helps. Anything?
Did you have anything, Deb?
Well, no, I would like to give the floor to the woman who has a question, but before we close tonight, whenever that is, no one has said anything about his critique of capital. I mean, that's what is at the heart of this as well. But I'm going to put that on hold because someone from the floor, yes.
Thank you. I think we're all aimed at the same thing. My question was for Dr. Hennessy and Dr. Raymond, because Dr. Hennessy spoke eloquently and movingly about the individual responsibility, which I think we all here feel. That's why we're here. And Dr. Raymond said, there, in the encyclical, and I did read it, there are powerful institutions that are tilted against humanity. How do we reconcile that? How do the small-voiced people influence those institutions? And I think possibly the answer is that a very powerful person with a powerful voice and an empathy for the poor has begun the conversation.
Oh, yeah.
And it's being heard worldwide.
Right.
I put great hope in that. If you would address that, Dr. Hennessy and Dr. Raymond.
Which one of us? You want to go first?
Yeah, something short. Since you mentioned game theory,
Okay, thanks.
there are plenty of models from game theory that do focus on cooperation and the concept that through cooperation, any individual actor will benefit more from that cooperation than from individual action. So I think to achieve the end that you made reference to, the rich and powerful have to be taught or made to realize that they will gain more through cooperation with the poor and disenfranchised than they will if, by not cooperating.
Yeah. You?
Yeah, I have a burning desire to say something. We are the rich and poor. We are the rich. We are the rich. We're sitting right here. And I understand when Chad talks about, global economics, he's talking about powerful nation states, and he's talking about transnational corporations. But we can't forget our responsibility in this. And we have to look deep within our hearts at our own consumption habits, right? I feel as though I'm shouting. Can you hear me, Jameson?
I can hear you.
We all of us here, and I'm going to take a risk by saying this, but we have to reassess the culture of consumption that links the acquisition of capital to self-worth. And all of us have been socialized in that vein. If you're driving down the road and you see someone driving a Maserati, you're wondering, who is that person? They must be someone important, right? And so I think we're all, our consumption habits, and this is what Francis is asking us to look at. He's asking us to take a deep look at not only who we are, but who we are relative to the material culture, how we consume goods. I ordered 2 small beauty products today from Nordstrom's, and it came in the mail in a box that was this big, right? It was this big. And I was preparing for this talk tonight, and I realized, I said to myself, Deb, you got to take a look at how you live. The Pope is calling me to take a look at how I live. How am I complicit in other people's suffering? How am I complicit in my daily life in other people's suffering? And that's what it's not going to be pretty. It's going to be hard for me to realize that I, too, as a member of the rich, as an American citizen living in this privileged nation, I have to take stock at my own practices, and that means my consumption habits. And that's what's causing such a controversy, I think, in the media around Francis's remarks, because many people think it's a deep critique of capitalism. And it is.
Can I interject just one thing along those lines? There's a quote. This is paragraph 203 on page 59, for those of you who are following along. So he's talking about this paradigm that Dr. Curtis was referencing, and he says that the paradigm leads people to believe that they are free as long as they have the supposed freedom to consume. Mm-hmm. But those really free are the minority who wield economic and financial power.
And I do. Sorry, Jayme.
I just want to get back
Go
to
ahead.
the community, if I could, for a minute here. I thank you for that question, because it's so important, and it does tie into the principle of subsidiarity. Governments need to do their part, but we need to do ours as well. But the community piece, a little bit lighthearted. A comedian pointed out the other night that Pope Francis has 1.2 billion followers, which means he has more followers than Justin Bieber. Good to know, right? So the Pope's. But that's 1.2 billion people that identify as Catholic and belong to communities. And this is the key thing. And the Pope and the document, it says, yes, individual action is important, but it has to be connected to a community. Know that this was written to be accessible to everyone sitting here, because the Pope wants you to read it. He wants you to discuss it. But he also recognizes that many of you belong to communities. 1.2 billion people can make a lot of difference in the world. And that appeal also to all those who identify with the faith tradition. And one of the things that this document has stressed is that the conversation that goes on about environmental degradation, and as well as environmental degradation and social degradation, one of the voices missing is the voice of wisdom that comes from the faith traditions. That there are communities in faith traditions that can make profound difference. 1.2 billion Catholics, that's one faith tradition in the world. How many others share some of the wisdom tradition and insights, and also that sense of not being distracted by materialism? I just want to read a comment from one of my students. And I was so struck by how many of the comments we were looking at indigenous people and the simplicity of their lives, and what does it mean for us in the West or the North. And this was not in relationship with this document, but I think this is why Pope Francis loves the young and trusts the young to know what is right. This student wrote, and this is a response to how should we live in the world in harmony with nature. I can envision at least one solid solution, and it entails honest self-reflection. Perhaps this may sound corny, but it would go a long, long way for everyone to take an honest, courageous, diligent look at themselves. In doing so, I hope it would become quite obvious that the materialistic lust many of us inhabit is largely a substitute of a deeper fulfillment that we all seek. What we need is a thorough reevaluation of our societal tendencies and beliefs, which starts at the individual level, Because from only there can we progress to what? A more healthier culture / community. Words of one of our students here at Salve, very inspirational, huh? Right? And very in tune with this document. I was so struck as my students were reflecting on nature and living in harmony with nature, how much of what they were saying and longing for and desiring in their own lives was spoke to in this document, right? So there's something, the author Walker Percy used to say, you're either onto something or you're lost in a malaise. And I was happy to see that my students were onto something. Our students.
I have a question. Is this on? I have a question for the panel. I was particularly struck by the encyclical and how often the word economy and economic came up some over 100 times versus climate came up about 20 times on a simple word search. And so I'm glad that that point was raised. And a lot of the comments that you're bringing up so far have been about the individual level, but I would like you to address institutional level change. We belong to an institution, Salve Regina University. What's our response? We belong to a community, an institution of Newport, Rhode Island. What's our collective response to this paradigm shift about the economy? And when it comes to the term sustainability, there is a part of that which is obviously economic and cultural, and you've spoken about that, but what about the ecology of sustainability? What does that mean for us in our relationship with the environment as a community, not just an individual, but as a community?
Well, Craig, do it. Let's bring some other folks into this. Craig, why don't you start?
Okay, so put me on the spot. I think it's impossible to, and I think he's very careful about this throughout the text, that it's impossible to separate the individual from the community. So there's a constant, at least as I read, a constant kind of back and forth between the two, that without individual commitment, it's hard to have a larger communal response, especially when you're in a democratic society in which, the people we vote for and who campaign for office are going to appeal to the things that they think are important to us, right? So if our lifestyle choices and our voting tendencies and what we sort of bring to bear are not the sort of concerns that we see here, we shouldn't just blame our politicians for saying, well, they're not doing anything about it, right? That, I can remember going back a couple presidential campaigns that when John Kerry was running for president, this is kind of the point where we're at that point, that he had actually a pretty good environmental record, but his campaign managers decided to downplay that because they actually found that was going to lose him votes, right? I mean, that's a problem. Now, hopefully, we've come a little ways since then, although that's not all that long ago, but if there is going to be a community response here, part of it is the political structures in place, but he's also, it talks about NGOs and talks about, other organizations that might be able to do things on the margins that maybe people start to pay more attention to. So, we are a part of many communities. The Catholic community is a particularly large one and a global community, but there are these smaller communities like Salve Regina, like Newport, Rhode Island, where we make choices about these things and how we vote and what we buy, right? Our consumer practices, right? I wanted to add to Deb's comments earlier that if every person in the world lived as Americans do, we would need 4 worlds to support the world, right? I mean, that's a problem, right? And at one point, I don't know if we want to get into the sticky situation here of population growth, which he kind of sidesteps a little bit. But he says, don't just talk to me about population growth. Talk to me about resource usage. How much stuff are you going through, right? The appeal to the universal right to water, which is near and dear to the Sisters of Mercy, is very early on here in the document. Without water, we don't survive very long at all, right? So, I think it's hard in some ways to separate the two in the same way that it's difficult when you appeal to the common good to say, well, do things that you don't want to do because, well, you owe it to others. I think he's trying to make the argument here that our own good is tied to the good of others, and this may go to the student comment that Jayme read, that our own personal fulfillment is misguided in a sense, that these don't have to be things that are opposed to one another, that they can actually work together, and he's trying to convince us of that. Duty-bound ethics are all well and good, right? But when we tell somebody, you have to do this, they usually, if they do it begrudgingly and say, okay, I'll do it because I have, right? Duty doesn't sound great, which is why I think at the end of this, he appeals to love, right? And says that, well, you got to want to do this, right? That someone who feels like, well, I'll recycle because I'm supposed to, or I'll get in trouble when I'm going through my trash. Long term, that's not going to do any good. That there has to be this lifestyle change that does have to. It can't stop right when I go outside the door. And I think it raises, for me at least, as a philosopher, it raises that tricky question all the time, right? When I teach an ethics course, am I just trying to convey different moral theories, or is part of it, especially being at a mercy institution, trying to make your students better people? And I don't know what the answer to that is, right? But part of me tends to think that, well, if I take the Pope seriously, that it shouldn't just be me about saying, well, here's what Kant said and here's what Aristotle said. But, part of it should be, okay, what does that mean for me now? And where do I go with that, right? Especially as we teach, each one of us might teach a couple hundred students every year. What do we communicate as faculty? And that applies, I think, to what we all do, right? Regardless of what your profession is. How does this enter into not only your personal life, but your professional life? Where you work, who you associate with, and how. You have to think on all these different levels, I think, if this is going to be effective.
Right. Can I want to just take a piece of what Dr. Chase said. The gentleman that asked the question is really should be up here. He's our environmental studies scholar, Dr. Jameson Chase. And so what I imagine going forward, Jameson, I don't know if you want to hear this. I don't know if anyone wants to hear this, but if we're going to follow his call as an institution, as a Catholic institution, for example, does that mean that we take a serious look at our investment portfolio as an institution and divest from companies and products that aren't promoting sustainable development? I think it does. Does it mean that we take seriously your recommendations as an environmental scholar? Yeah, I think it does. And it means that we make sacrifices. And that's what he calls us to do. He says we have to make sacrifices as an institution and as individuals.
Got a question?
Okay, so I kind of realized while you guys were speaking that you were sort of answering the same question that I'm going to ask, but maybe some of you have another opportunity to respond. As Dr. Hennessy said, the Pope has a lot of followers, so his message is going out to a lot of people around the world, but environmental, or people who are inspired to do things about the environment are often, they sort of get a stigma, called earthy crunchy, things like that. How can we convince the world that environmental issues are urgent and can only be solved with the cooperation of the majority, and that needs to start at an individual level? And how, in the words of Socrates, how can we convince them that the unexamined life is not worth living?
Can we get a scientist's perspective on this?
Kind of being caught off guard here. I was ready to answer some scientific questions. I think, again, I have to just go back to, whether or not you're a believer in, climate change, human-induced climate change, or not. I mean, it comes down to that moral question in doing the right thing. I don't know if I'm going to be answering your questions. So what was the main point of your question, just to getting around that stigma of being considered?
How can we convince people that environmental issues are important and urgent?
How do we convince people that environmental issues are urgent and important?
Well, again, I think just thinking of the future of the planet. We have to stop thinking about ourselves and think about the bigger picture. We want to address these questions and do the right thing for future generations. So, you just have to get out there and do it and not worry about what anybody else thinks.
Just very quick, I mean, education becomes important, I think, on this front. What are we teaching? How are we teaching it? I see my capstone students out there, and my capstone's environmentally focused. A lot of my students say, they're 22 years old, right, and maybe at the end of their educational path, and they said, we've never talked about any of this stuff. Right, so, when do we start talking about it? How do we talk about it? If we don't know, it's easy to brush off the science if we haven't studied the science, right? So, what are we teaching in schools? More and more people worldwide are being educated today than at any point in human history, which is a great thing. But, what do we prioritize in that teaching? I think that becomes an important part of the puzzle.
We got a couple of questions that I'm going to come over to the other side of the room, I promise. If you have a question, raise your hand. We'll take a few more. I think I just want to chime in on that point. I think it's also safer today for people to challenge science and challenge what is known. I have a wife who works in a public school, and their science department is challenged all the time for talking about climate change. That's something that I think is perhaps a uniquely modern phenomena where it's more than acceptable. It's almost expected to challenge the best that science has taught us. But that's my opinion for the night. We've got a question right here.
We were kind of talking about earlier the difference between the materialistic nature of our society and kind of the difference between I guess how do I want to say this? The difference between the rich and the poor and how it's really far spread. But I was thinking that it's been definitely a much more recent thing where almost everything I've looked into purchasing, or when you go to look at to buy something, everything is linked to a charity, or everything is linked to something that gives back. And I think that's a phenomenon that's become way more prevalent now than it used to be, that almost, not almost everything, but a lot of different types of things and a lot of different markets are now directly linked to charities. And I think that's something that's probably a newer thing that has come from people who really do care about the environment, or really do care about where they're working or who they're working with, or animals. And I could list off 10 right now of different things. One works with bullets that are taken from guns that are taken off the street, and they're turned into jewelry, and then it funds programs to help kids stay off the streets in dangerous neighborhoods, or finding or digging up landmines and turning them into jewelry, and then funding projects to help dig these up and make it a safer environment in Cambodia. And almost everything is linked to that, and I think that's become a really important thing that younger people are really working towards. They know things will sell, and they know people will buy things, so then they're linking them to charities and their passion. So I think that's a step in the right direction. I just wanted to see if you guys have heard the same thing, or what you think about that.
Reactions?
I really don't want to crush your dreams, but I'll make an analogy. So if all goes according to, I guess, the best plan after we're done with this event and this plastic glass is empty, it's going to go into a bin and it will be recycled, which is great. It's like not going in the landfill. But that avoids the question, do we really need to drink water out of a plastic cup? The answer is clearly no. So I think one of the points that comes across in the encyclical is that by tying one's sense of well-being or social status to the act of consumption, that makes consumption part of the problem. If we are living in a world that is driven by this so-called rationalist or modernist paradigm, we may in fact invent some new technology like recycling that solves one problem, but in the process we're creating others that didn't even exist before. So I think one of the Pope's key points here is that anytime consumption gets divorced from the concept of human dignity, the situation is probably getting worse.
And I think just to follow up on that, something that would be, I don't know if we have any of our Ph.D. students here from Salve, but they would certainly appreciate the fact that again and again he comes back to this notion that technology can't solve all the problems of technology. Right? That to think that we could come up with a techno-scientific solution to everything is misguided. Right? Now, reading some reactions to this, a lot of people have been quite critical of him on that front, right? And say that this almost comes off as being anti-science, right? Anti-modernity. But he does say that repeatedly, that we shouldn't fall into this trap to say, well, we're creating this problem now, but we'll come up with some way to solve it, right? Or somebody smart will come up with some way of solving it. And he says, well, in some ways that's kind of a lazy way of going about it, that, again, we have to respond individually and ask, should the cup exist in the first place, right? That's the sort of further question that we should be asking.
A question up here.
So my question kind of goes about institutions in general. We're talking about how institutions kind of have this responsibility to take over with all these environmental things going on and kind of be stewards and show other people that if institutions can do it, then of course we can do it as individuals. And to use Salve as an example, I'm sure there are many other institutions as well, but just as an example, so we're doing obviously a huge renovation on one of our buildings. Now, this building has perfect opportunities with flat ceilings and things like that to put solar panels and to make all of these great advances we can to be role models for the rest of Aquidneck Island and all of our students here. And I know it's been brought up to Salve about things like this, but there's always that constant response of, oh, well, that's too expensive, or it costs too much money. And not that this is just Salve, but all institutions kind of have this problem of, oh, well, it's going to cost a lot more money. We don't know when we're going to get our money back in this. And my question, I guess, is where do you draw this line? And what becomes too expensive and what becomes worth it simply because it is the right thing to do and it does make us better stewards of the environment. So just in general, as being a big problem, I'm sure that's going to be coming up continuously for all institutions across worldwide. So where do you draw that line between money and what's right?
I just wanted the question to...
Sorry, go ahead.
No,
please, go ahead.
Well, I wanted the question to hang in the air for a while. I was hoping that you would answer it. But Dr. Hennessy's going to refer to the document.
No, actually, but you're right. I'm hoping you would answer it as the right answer. Because there are two things. The document, and I didn't do a great job of writing out page numbers, but the document does talk about that tension between making reforms and, what is the cost of the reform to achieve sustainability. And it did not want to let people off the hook on that one. So it acknowledged the tension, but didn't collapse the tension and say, oh, it's too expensive, you can't do it. And I think Dr. Curtis asking, how are you going to answer the question is actually kind of the right answer. With the idea of communities and individuals, the idea that the communities or the governing parties, what is it we ask of our institutions, right? To not see them kind of amorphous or beyond being responsible to us. And I think the more that Salve students, Salve faculty, staff, and alum see this as a value, that's something for the institution to consider.
Yeah, I think one thing he comes back to is we have to think about the true costs of these things, right? So, when we talk about costs, we usually think of the short-term economic cost of something, but he says we're bracketing out all that other stuff, right? How much carbon is produced, right? How many jobs are being lost, right? That all of this needs to be calculated and calculated from the start, right? So he talks about business models. He says don't tack on the environmental thing at the end. That should be there from the start, right? And oftentimes when we do this, we'll find that long term, these are actually better solutions. From a more particular Salve perspective, I would say, faculty complain about things all the time, but when students complain about things in great numbers, people respond. So that's kind of a call to students out there because, you are the guys who are paying the bills here in many ways, right? And they'll listen, don't put me down on this from an administrative standpoint since I have no authority at all, but they'll listen to students more, right, than faculty who, again, we do complain about things all the time, but, voices of young people, voices of students who say, hey, what about this for this building? Organize, we talk about that community aspect, get signatures, get people together, push for these sorts of things and appeal to, we got a great mission here that's very easy to appeal to with issues like this, right? That this notion of stewardship is a part of what our university is about, right? So making those appeals is not out of bounds at all, right?
Can I just make one comment in relation to the question that was asked? I think your answer lies in another question, which is the institutional response you're seeing going to perpetuate the structural inequities that already exist in the world? And when that question is answered, you'll have the answer to the initial question.
I don't know if this is working. It seems that, from what I'm hearing, that the Pope's emphasis is on individual responsibility, and that seems to be echoed in this distinguished panel's view of this, and that might extend out to the community. But I would submit that if everyone in this room walked out of here today and never used another molecule of carbon, we would make no impact whatsoever on overall global warming. That everybody has to do it all at once. And in fact, if we did that, the best we could hope for is lower the price of energy so that other people would use more of it. So does the Pope or do people on the panel see any more policy type of changes, such as putting a price on carbon as an answer that would answer this young lady's question? If carbon's more expensive, then all of a sudden solar panels have a lot shorter payback. And so the question is, to what degree does the Pope or the panel feel that we should have a more rigorous policy change? To what degree does the panel feel that that's a feasible thing that can be done? I mean, can we get a price on carbon in a way that which has been shown in the past? Anybody who's old enough to have lived through the energy shortages of 74 and 79 will know that our use of energy dropped precipitously during that time. And so that's the question out there. How are we going to affect policy so that everybody gets on board with this?
I should start with a disclaimer that I'm really cheap. Somebody, I can't remember who it was, but somebody once said that the cheapest energy is the energy that you don't use. So even though we live in a global community in which there are places where gasoline is cheaper for the consumer than water or milk, for the people in this room, there are certain opportunity costs that are involved in our consumption choices. And I think that there can easily be more policies created that structure those opportunity costs in ways that convince people to act more responsibly, toward the environment, toward the climate, toward the poor. The other thing I'll mention gets more toward what other folks are more expert on, which is that the constant pursuit of the acquisition of material goods is spiritually empty. We in fact know this from social science, because once you hit a certain level of income, your increase in happiness tapers off, and eventually it's a flat line. So the more stuff you acquire, it's not necessarily going to make you any happier. So when people learn that, suddenly it's a whole new ballgame. They suddenly realize, these closets that are full of clothing that I never wear, they're not making me any happier, and they could clothe somebody who doesn't have clothing. So I'll stop there.
I I would say just very quickly, there's not a lot of, for those who haven't read it, there's not a lot of specific policy here. Whether we're critical of him for that, I don't know. I can't really find the passage. I think at one point he talks about, I recall him talking about carbon credits, and he doesn't like that. That's about as close as he got to policy at any point in this document. But, so if I were to say what I'd like to see in something else additional here, the next big climate summit is coming up in December in Paris. Call us out, right? Say, the U.S., Kyoto, Copenhagen, we're not ratifying any of this. And again, maybe he didn't want to do that because he didn't want to turn people off to the larger message here. But there's not a lot of policy here. And whether he wants us to work that out, presumably he does. But I don't know what others felt about that.
I think agreed. It's not addressing policy per se. It wanted to get into the deeper moral motivations, right? And he talks about with the various concords that have been developed and meetings that there's a tendency for laws to be developed and then laws to be subverted. And so bringing into dialogue here, and what he's trying to say is that this conversation, and he emphasizes we need a global dialogue and we need an emphasis on global solidarity. That we need to look at that common good so that my motivation is not a sense of punitive law and order, or you're reducing my freedom, but I am truly choosing to live out of the full potential of who I am as one who loves my neighbor and acts for the good of humanity and for intergenerational good, that this world will flourish, right? And that all human beings in this world will flourish.
Folks, this is a conversation that we could go on all night. And those of you who want to stay and continue the conversation, I'm sure you can buttonhole these folks before we go. But we are out of time. I do want to just say one thing to the student in the back. I'm sorry, we're out of time. The student in the back, there's a strategic planning process underway right now. There are forums being held on campus for members of the campus community. That kind of input's exactly what they want to hear. So if you haven't been to one of those yet, there are several still upcoming. There was an email that you should have gotten a couple of weeks ago providing information about how to get to those things. I hope you'll come. I hope that you'll be a part of that and have your voice be heard. And I would invite that to other members of the community too. I want to.
Yeah.
Who wants to talk? You're a good faculty.
Normally I would say no, but since you said it so nicely, one quick question.
Thanks. I think it was you, Debbie. You said before this night's over, you'd like something to be said about unbridled capitalism, as mentioned in that document, and I just wanted to pursue that and maybe get.
Don't look at me.
I think it was you, Debbie, that said it, but I'm not sure.
Yeah.
And so, one of us should say something then.
One of us. Okay. I still want. All right, so he's getting a lot of heat from conservatives who think that he is a socialist or something. He's critiquing the market. He's critiquing unbridled capitalism. He's critiquing the fact that we live in a mode of production where profit is the organizing principle, where we do everything out of profit, and he's calling us out on that. I don't think he's calling for an end to capitalism. I think he's calling for us to move maybe beyond it in other ways. I mean, I don't know what to say, Father, except that, I wanted to come back to this gentleman's question. Should the fossil fuel industry pay the price for the damage? Is that the sort of...
You're asking me?
Yeah.
What I think the fossil fuel industry does not pollute. We all do. They just take it out of the ground and we use it. And if the price went up for us, we would use less, and we would, and as far as divesting fossil fuels would become divested because there's no market for them. And actually, this could be done in a very benign way if every penny that was collected as a fee were rebated at a flat rate back to consumers. If 100% of the fee were rebated back at a flat rate, actually the economy would grow under that circumstance, and we would decrease our carbon emissions by 50% in 20 years.
I'm so glad that you asked that question, and I'm so glad you answered it.
Sure.
Just something to think about. Pope Francis has been clear in subsequent interviews, I'm not a capitalist, I'm not a communist, right? He says, what I do is I bring biblical ideas to bear on our lives. And there are complications with the free market system. Remember Adam Smith? He's operating within religious worldview. And so one of his maxims is do unto others as you would have do unto yourself. So he's operating under the idea in he's got moral sentiments, he's got the notion of benevolence. And so what's happened is we live in a secular world. There's no longer a moral compass automatically built into our society for capitalism. So will it be realized in a way that's virtuous, where it lifts people up through free market enterprise? Or does it exercise itself in a way that's vicious, that ends up hurting people and causing problems with human degradation?
Folks, we're going to leave it there, but could we please have a warm round of applause for Craig Condella, Debra, Jayme Hennessy, Susan Meshwitz, and Chad Raymond. And thank all of you. Have a great night.
Great work, yeah.
Well done.